They've chosen Ava Thompson for marketing director." The words dropped like a brick in my chest. I sat perfectly still, eyes fixed on the slideshow behind our VP, but everything blurred around the edges. I could hear a few polite claps, forced scattered like people weren't sure if they were celebrating or apologizing. That name shouldn't have been called. Not today. Not after everything I'd built. I had led our department through 3 chaotic quarters, pulled off 2 national campaigns with record ROI, and trained half the team that now filled the room. And yet Ava, the same Ava who once forwarded a pitch deck without removing insert real data here from slide 4. She stood up all smiles and modest shrugs as if she didn't know this wasn't earned. I watched my manager grin like a proud parent. Ava just has that spark she had told me once. She's vibrant. People like her. I suppose substance doesn't sparkle the same way charisma does. My name is Serena Hall. 6 years ago, I left a stable teaching job to prove I could compete in corporate marketing. I didn't come here for applause, I came to build. And that morning, they made one very clear: they never really saw me. But they would. Because of this story, it won't end how you think. It will make you furious, thrilled, and just maybe inspired. Before we get into the details, please grab a cup of tea, turn up the volume, and don't forget to comment and tell us where in the world you are and what time it is in your local area. We want to know how far these stories go. I didn't cry after the meeting. I didn't even storm out. Instead, I walked back to my desk like I had every other day for 6 years, head-high steps, steady. But inside, something quiet had snapped. Not a breakdown. A breaking free. When I left my career in education to dive into marketing, people thought I'd lose myself in the chaos. I had been a high school STEM teacher, building lesson plans and coaching robotics teams. Not exactly corporate material, they said. But I saw patterned systems and human logic. And that same logic told me that results' real measurable impact would always matter more than popularity. Turns out I was wrong. Or at least bad in the world I'd landed in. I remember my first big campaign at Bright Edge Media. They handed me a dying client account, one everyone else had given up on. Within 4 weeks, I restructured their ad flow, shifted their audience targeting, and drove a 38% uptick in conversions. 3 months later, that account was renewed for double the budget. No applause. No memo. It was just nice work in passing while Ava got a shout-out for organizing the Friday bagel run. That wasn't the only time. Over the years, I designed a tracking model that helped cut reporting time in half-trained 3 entry-level hires into lead strategists and salvaged 2 more failing accounts. Yet somehow I became invisible, efficient, reliable, but forgettable. The people who noticed were usually the ones who quietly asked for help on deadline day. They knew I'd deliver, but they didn't think it made me leadership material. Once I asked my manager if I should be more visible. Her reply: maybe just loosen up. Smile more. Maybe post something fun on the team's Slack once in a while. Emojis could replace impact. But I kept moving. I told myself the work would speak for itself. That merit still meant something. Still, the truth hit harder than I expected when Ava was promoted that morning. It wasn't just a title they handed her. It was years of my effort rewritten in her narrative. So I did the only thing that made sense. I started gathering everything, the data, the frameworks, the processes I had built from scratch, not to steal, but to document, to prove, if only to myself, that my contributions were real. And that's when the idea hit. Maybe the system I had been refining wasn't just for this job. Perhaps it was meant for something bigger. That night, I opened a blank file and typed 3 words at the top: build it better. I didn't know it then, but that moment marked the beginning of something no performance review could ever capture. During those late nights compiling reports that no one asked for but everyone depended on, I started noticing the pattern. Every time Ava forgot a deadline, there was a joke. There were nods every time she spoke up in a meeting, even if she repeated what someone else had said. Somehow she'd mastered the art of seeming essential without doing anything necessary. Ava Thompson. The name itself sounded like a personal brand. She had a calendar full of one-on-one coffees, a Slack presence filled with gifts and motivational quotes, and an uncanny ability to rephrase others' insights just enough to sound like she thought of them first. Her real talent wasn't marketing, it was marketing herself. What made it harder was that she was nice. It's not manipulative or cruel, just airbrushed. She remembered birthdays, complimented outfits, and laughed too loudly at every joke. It was all perfectly likable, but no one blinked when we launched our biggest campaign of the year, and she presented a strategy nearly identical to mine from a month before. My deck had been too technical, her version was approachable. Same data, different voice. I learned quickly that charisma carried more weight in our office than competence. Once in a team meeting, she fumbled a client's core metric confused reach with conversion, and everyone laughed it off. "She's got charm," someone whispered beside me like that was enough to cancel out the facts. I wish I could say it didn't bother me. I rose above it and stayed focused. But the truth is, I started questioning myself. Was I too intense, too quiet, too focused on getting things right? That self-doubt is subtle. It doesn't scream. It creeps in when you realize the same standards don't apply to everyone. When your wins are routine, someone else's basics are called brilliance. So I did what I always did. I worked harder, sharpened every presentation, and triple-checked every deliverable. And when Ava was named team lead on a project I had prepped for months, I didn't say a word. I just documented everything. Not out of spite, but because I had stopped hoping someone would speak up for me. If I wanted my work to matter, I had to ensure it left a trail. And maybe, just maybe, the day would come when charm couldn't hide the cracks. When the spotlight turned, what was real would finally outshine what only looked golden. The decision to build something of my own didn't come with fireworks or a grand aha moment. It started small and quiet, like most important things do. One evening, after another round of applause for Ava's latest team icebreaker idea, I sat at my desk. I stared at the open spreadsheet in front of me, the one I used to model performance data across 8 campaigns. It was clunky, yes, but functional. What struck me wasn't just that it worked, it was that no one else had noticed how often they relied on it. That night on the train home, I opened my laptop and sketched something better. It's not a prettier version of the spreadsheet, a smarter one that could learn from past inputs, flag performance anomalies, and suggest real-time times. I wasn't trying to start a company. I was solving a problem the way I always had, by building quietly. Every evening after dinner, I'd code for an hour. On weekends, I took online courses in machine learning and UX design. I taught myself how to structure algorithms, test logic trees, and build a basic interface. I didn't tell anyone, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want another set of empty compliments. I wanted something real, measurable, mine. By month 3, the prototype could predict ad fatigue and recommend new content cycles. By month 5, it could auto-generate basic performance summaries. I called it simply Nova, short for New Star, because that's what it felt like, something igniting in the dark. At work, I kept my head down. Let Ava keep collecting credit for team morale. I didn't care anymore. Not because I had given up, but because I had redirected. Every time I was overlooked, Nova got better. Whenever a report I built was renamed in someone else's email, I added another feature. I ran a test simulation using last year's campaign data one weekend. Nova's optimizations would have saved us nearly $600,000. I sat there staring at the number, and a calm came over me. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about creation. They had built a culture around who was most liked. I was creating something that couldn't be ignored. And deep down, I knew when the time came, Nova wouldn't just be a tool. It would be proof. While they were celebrating charisma, I was laying the foundation for something that would outlast applause. The final straw came not from some dramatic confrontation, but from a meeting invite titled Team Vision Alignment. That's how they framed it, Vision Alignment. Translation: Ava's official promotion ceremony disguised as a workshop. I watched her take the floor like she was born to lead, speaking in airy bullet points about synergy and engagement. My ideas, repurposed again, were now part of her vision. I smiled politely, took my notes, and nodded in all the right places. But inside, something had settled. That evening, I printed my resignation letter. It was short and professional. 2 weeks' notice gratitude for the experience, the usual language people use to soften a departure. But behind that letter was another page, tucked neatly into the envelope. It wasn't bitter or accusatory. It was factual, clean. It outlined Nova's development timeline dates, benchmarks, and simulation outcomes, and included a 1-page executive summary of the projected impact of integrated company-wide. At the bottom, a single line read, "Patent filed April 12th. Provisional approval granted June 3rd. I didn't want a counteroffer, I didn't want to be convinced to stay, and I wanted the truth documented, not just what I had built, but what they had chosen to ignore. The next morning, I walked into my manager's office, placed the envelope on her desk, and said, "This is my formal resignation. I'll ensure a smooth transition." She blinked twice, unsure if she heard me right, and then reached for the envelope like it might burn her fingers. "Serena, can we talk this through?" Her voice softened, cautious. "I think everything you need to know is in there," I said. I walked out before she opened it. By lunch, I'd already received 2 calendar invites, one from HR and the other from someone I hadn't heard from in months, the VP of Strategic Development. Word had spread. But I wasn't looking for attention anymore. I'd already begun my handoff notes. I spent that afternoon organizing workflows, archiving campaign assets, and preparing clean documentation for whoever would take over. Ava peeked over my desk, once curiosity in her eyes, but said nothing. She didn't know what was coming. None of them realized that Nova wasn't just a project. It was a message. And they had just opened the first page. 3 days after I handed in my resignation, I got an email that made me pause mid-sip of morning coffee. The sender, Thomas Reed, Chief Strategy Officer at Lumora, a lean, fast-scaling tech firm we used to call our closest competitor. Though they never once chased us, they didn't need to. His message was simple. "Serena, I've been following your work for a while. We should talk. Coffee." I stared at the screen, then reread it. Twice. We met at a quiet cafe off Lincoln and Fifth. It wasn't one of those sleek startup hangouts, just an old bookstore with a barista who knew every regular by name. Thomas arrived precisely within time, with no entourage or formalities, just a notepad, a pen, and the kind of focus that doesn't come from small talk. "I heard you're building something that changes how teams think," he said, stirring cream into his coffee. "And I think you're too smart to walk away from it now." I didn't launch into a pitch or open a laptop. I told him what Nova did, how it wasn't just about automation, but adaptive learning about scaling decision-making without losing nuance. He listened not to reply, but to understand. When I mentioned how our beta simulation saved $600 to $1,000 in campaign spending, he didn't blink. He asked how it handled cultural bias in data sets. No one at Bright Edge ever asked me that. After an hour, he slid a folder across the table. Inside, a partnership offer. It was not just a job equity, full control of product development, and a clear path to lead a division focused on marketing intelligence. I didn't answer right away. I finished my coffee, closed the folder gently, and looked him in the eye. "You sure you want someone who walked away from their last team?" He smiled. "I want someone who knows when to stop building someone else's dream." That stayed with me. All the way home. I am through rereading the offer. Through the phone call I got that night from Ava asking if I'd left because of her. No, I didn't leave because of her. I left because someone saw what I was building for the first time in a long time, and it was time to stop hiding it. I signed the offer the next morning, not out of spite, not to prove anything to anyone. But real value doesn't need to be explained to the right people. It just needs to be seen. The day I stepped into Lumora's offices, it felt like crossing into another version of reality, one where ideas weren't filtered through politics, where questions were welcomed, not feared. My desk overlooked the skyline, but I barely noticed the view. I was too focused, too ready, Within weeks, Nova was no longer just a quiet side project. It became our cornerstone. We refined it, tested it in real time with active clients, and watched results climb: campaign efficiency, up by 42%, churn rates, down by half. For the first time in my career, I wasn't the one pushing for metrics, I was being asked for them. Then one morning, just as I was wrapping up a sprint planning session, my old colleague Matteo sent a Slack ping with just 2 words: check news. I opened the link. My old company, Bright Edge Media, was in the headlines. Major client exodus follows Q3 performance collapse, the banner read. Below is a stark breakdown: 3 flagship clients pulled out citing inconsistent reporting structures and lack of campaign insight. Budgets ballooned. Timelines slipped. And one quote hit harder than all the rest. We trusted them because their systems worked. Now it feels like they're guessing. Jordan Meeks, CMO of a former client I'd personally onboarded. I sat back stunned. Not smug, not satisfied, just silent. Another ping. This time a message from Kayla, another former team member. Ava's in tears. Nobody knows what to fix. That line hit differently because I did know. I had built the fix. They just didn't want it when it wasn't wrapped in small talk and charm. I thought about the documents I left behind, the summary, the projections, the missed chances. They'd had every tool in their hands, but without someone who understood the foundation, they were trying to rebuild a machine with the wrong manual. I closed the tab, sipped my now cold coffee, and returned to my code. Not out of coldness, not because I didn't care, but because what breaks in one place doesn't have to hurt you. Sometimes it's proof that you were holding more together than anyone realized. And now that you're not there, the silence is finally loud enough for them to hear what they chose to ignore. Something interesting happened after the headlines faded and the last client quotes made their rounds on LinkedIn. My inbox started filling with messages, not just congratulations, but questions from agencies I'd never worked with and directors I'd never met. They wanted to know how we'd done it, so they took a clunky side project and turned it into a platform reshaping how teams ran campaigns from the inside out. That was when I realized Nova wasn't just proving useful. It was becoming something bigger than me. At Lumora, we weren't running on ego. We ran on clarity. Our Monday check-ins weren't about spotlighting who spoke the most, but about what worked and how to improve it. I led a team of engineers, data analysts, and content strategists who all understood one thing: we weren't building a product. We were building a new way of thinking. And it started showing. Client satisfaction scores reached record highs. One marketing lead told us, "It's like your system sees the problem before I even notice it." Word spread. Soon 3 Fortune 500 companies entered licensing talks. My calendar was booked not with damage control, but with workshops training other teams to think like strategists, not just task fillers. But the best moment didn't come in a boardroom. On Thursday afternoon, our CEO Maya stopped by my office unannounced. She handed me a plaque with my name on it beneath it, the words, Director of Innovation Systems. I looked up surprised. She smiled and said, "It's not just what you built. It's how you changed how we see value." For the first time in a long time, I felt my name stand for something more than dependable. It stood for different, for decisive, for doing the work no one else wanted to dig into. Later that night, I walked past the conference room and saw my team scribbling on whiteboards, arguing over better logic paths and testing variables. I realized they weren't just working late, they were excited. Because now our work wasn't invisible. It wasn't buried behind someone louder. It had a name, a team, a future. I'd spent years waiting for someone to notice what I could do. They were noticed because of what I'd built, not in the shadows, not by accident, but on purpose. And that more than any title was the legacy I wanted to start. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when it arrived, just another unread notification in a long list of system updates and client pings. But something about the subject line made me pause. From Jenna Michaels' subject apology, I hadn't seen her name in months. Not since the day I slid that envelope across her desk and walked out without a backward glance. She had been my manager. The one who smiled politely while promoting charisma over competence. The one who told me to be more visible as if visibility could replace value. I clicked it open. I assume you've seen what's happening at Bright Edge. It began. I wanted you to hear this directly. I was wrong, deeply wrong. She didn't skirt around it. She acknowledged the collapse, the client's loss, and the failure of the internal systems. She even named the report I'd attached to my resignation, which she once brushed off as too technical for our current focus. According to her, now the same report was being dissected by the board in an emergency restructuring meeting. "I've stepped down," she wrote. "Ava resigned 3 weeks ago. Turns out charm doesn't scale." I read it once, then again, not because I needed to, but because some of me still couldn't believe she'd said you were right. For a moment, I just sat there, letting the silence fill the space. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like closure. There was a time when an email like that would have cracked something open in me. It was a time when I would have replayed every meeting, every missed opportunity, every time I swallowed my voice to keep the peace. But that time had passed. Now I was here. I helped design a space surrounded by people who didn't need to be convinced of my worth. They just worked beside it. I typed slowly. "Thank you for your message, Jenna. I appreciate your honesty. And yes, you're right. Results do matter. I wish you well in what comes next." I hit send, then closed my laptop. That chapter was finished. Because sometimes the most powerful moment isn't when someone apologizes. It's when you realize you don't need it to move forward. You've already built what they couldn't see. And now they're the ones left trying to catch up. The following week, our quarterly all-hands meeting fell on a bright Friday morning, the kind of morning when even the traffic feels lighter and the coffee tastes a little sweeter. But as I stepped up to the front of the room, the usual project roadmap wasn't what I held in my hands. Instead, I had a story. "I want to start today with something personal," I said, scanning the room. My team engineers, creatives, strategists sat in a circle, coffees in hand, quiet but engaged. I used to think that someone would eventually notice if I worked hard enough, stayed late enough, and delivered better results than anyone else. That merit had its gravity. If I focused on the work, the rest would follow. Some heads nodded. A few leaned in. But I learned the hard way that sometimes people don't reward substance. Sometimes they reward noise. And when that happens, it's not because you're not good enough, they don't know how to see you. A silence settled over the room. Not uncomfortable, just still. I almost let that blind spot define me. I almost stayed quiet. But instead I built. Not for recognition. Not even for revenge. I built because I believed the work mattered even if no one else did. I told them about Nova. About the nights coding alone, the decision to walk away, and the quiet resolve that followed. And how in the absence of applause I had found purpose. Not to prove anyone wrong, but to prove myself right. By the end, no one clapped. Not yet. They just sat there soaking it in. And that to me meant more than any standing ovation. Here we don't build for noise, I finished. We build for impact. And we lead not with volume, but with vision. Later that day, as I packed up to leave, I noticed someone had scribbled a note on the whiteboard in the hallway. It said, "Build quietly, then let the results speak." I smiled. As I drove home that evening, the city stretched out before me golden in the low sun. On the way, I passed the old Bright Edge building. The logo was still there, but the lights inside were dim. A for-lease sign flickered in one of the windows. I didn't feel bitterness. I felt grateful. Because being underestimated wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of something bigger. Before you go, please grab a cup of tea, turn up the volume, and don't forget to comment and tell us where you are and what time it is in your local area. We want to know how far these stories go.